How is everybody?
We are
It's like
all about you.
Yeah. Let's see. Can you pronounce your names?
Mine is Cemre.
Cemre, okay. And
mine is Zehra.
Zehra, okay. It's handy to have the name in the grid. I think I will put my headphones on. Okay. You see people are coming in, yeah?
Yes, so we are going to be wait a little minute.
Yeah. Let me try my screen share.
Yes, if it is possible, you can try it.
Okay. How's that?
We can see it. It's great.
Yeah. Okay, good. And did you get my my website links as well?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Because I just have been having not so great luck, and I'm not even at home now, where sometimes the connection drops, and then, but I have like my iPad, my phone, so if my computer, but so far it seems good, which I'm gonna,
okay.
Yeah. But yeah, the images are important, but the websites as well. And can you just remind me how long you have scheduled? I know we said when we first planned, but I didn't go back and look.
Our open lessons usually take 1 hour. According to our questions, this time may vary. And I would like to ask how much time you have, and then we continue to receive questions maybe according to your time.
Yeah, I am. So we'll definitely go for 1 hour. So my presentation maybe 30 minutes or something, or I mean, I can go longer. I probably will. What would you like?
Maybe your presentation take 30 minutes, and then we are going to go with our questions.
Yeah. Yep. And then if we want to go a little longer, that's okay for me. Like, I know on Zoom people get tired, and you've had a lot of events, so maybe we'll see. We'll check in, right? So we'll see at 1 hour, how is everybody feeling? Then we can go for another 15 minutes. Then if they're still, yeah, is that good? Yeah. Okay, great. I see you spotlighted my video, and yeah, and feel free to use the chat. You know, if people have questions along the way or something's not clear, I'm okay with that. And similarly, if you want to post the website links, you know, if people want to get more information about the collections I'm discussing, then we have that. So that's good too.
Okay, so since that our guests are coming, let me start slowly. Welcome to our 8th Boğaziçi Pride Month events, and I would like to celebrate our Pride Month. Happy Pride to you all. First of all, I welcome all of you, everyone who are here with us. It's a very valuable thing for us to be here. I am Cemre Erdal, and I'm a Turkish language literature first year student. I am also a volunteer at Serbian organization. And today we have our dear guest, Ann Cvetkovich, who stands out with her women and gender studies. I would like to thank you very much for joining us and not refusing our invitation. We are very happy and honored to see you among us. And thank you very much for coming again. So now on, I'm going to explain what Serbesism is and what purpose it is working on, as always, before letting go to our open lecture. As Serbesism, free literature in English, which cares about and struggles for a democratic and a free university environment with the motto that the academy does not obey, we are involved in the resistance from an academic framework in order to create an alternative academy. And nowadays, we continue to organize open lectures as part of the Pride Month events. In these days, when we are going through processes such as the closure of LGBT plus studies club, the detention of our friends who carry rainbow flags, and the opening of an investigation against them, we, as Serbesism or free literature, demonstrate that our existence, colors, and identity are far beyond these, and other visibility will not be denied in any area of life, nor will be denied in academia with the events we will organize during the month of Pride. Finally, we do not see the appointment which an invasion and disrespect our rights, culture, and autonomy as legitimate, and we ignore the effort to fade our colors, and we continue to exist with all colors in every field. And now I just want to say something little before we start. If our guests have questions, they can send their questions to a friend named Ask Me through a private chat, or so we can ask your questions our lovely guest, Ann Cvetkovich. So if everything is clear and done, let's start our open lecture. Now I will share with you the biography of our guest, Ann Cvetkovich. And Ann Cvetkovich is currently director of the Pauline Jouet Institute of Women's and Gender Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. She has been Ellen Clayton Garwood Centennial Professor of English and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She has been co-editor with Anne-Maria Jagosa of A Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies, and her current writing projects focus on the current state of LGBTQ archives and the creative use of them by artists to create counter-archives and interventions in public history. In her scholarship, Cvetkovich engages with feminist and queer theory, affect and feelings, theories of the archive, and the oral history. She has also argued for the significance of looking at the everyday effects of trauma. Her interdisciplinary work explores a wide range of cultural and artistic forms, including documentary film, memoirs, music and dance performances, literature, and visual arts. And now I would like to leave the floor to Ann Cvetkovich for her speech.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. And also, since we have had some chance to correspond beforehand, but haven't had time to build a relationship with one another or with the organization, I'm very intrigued to learn more about the history that you just referred to in your introduction. So it's a lot to think about. I know that when we were in touch, you suggested that we might want to keep the tone light rather than heavy. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish, but I hope, yeah, I'm just thinking about some of the repression of LGBTQ lives in Turkey and elsewhere that I'm familiar with. And I know that it's very difficult to speak freely often, so I probably won't say more than that, but I appreciate the struggle that you may be involved in. I'm also happy that Zoom can bring me to you. This has been one of the good fortunes. People have called it COVID silver linings of the pandemic. Actually, I've been writing on this notion of a COVID silver lining because it's been very interesting to me. It's a very colloquial English term, so I'm not even sure how it would translate into Turkish, but I will say the chance to make these connections, even though I would much prefer, of course, to be with you in Istanbul, but that would be expensive and time consuming. I will just say that for me, Istanbul is, I've been twice. For me, it's one of the most important cities I've ever visited. It is in many ways a living archive. There is also a lot of erasure of the archive that's present in the landscape. And so you have, I think, I feel a bit humble, right, coming to you with these examples from the US and the Canadian context. But again, these talks are an opportunity to compare notes and to make connections across the local. So I would be very interested to learn anything that you can tell me about the situation with specifically LGBTQ archives there. Although I've visited and talked to people doing that kind of work, I was thinking, oh, do I know what's going on? And I feel like I don't. So today, what I hoped to do was to just share with you some of the work that I have been doing in recent years as a kind of follow-up to the book I published. It's almost 20 years ago, and I'm thinking about doing a 20th anniversary edition because so much has happened in the world of archives that I have continued to participate in that I feel it's going to be valuable to look back and think about that work. So that's why in my PowerPoint here, I called this an archive of lesbian feelings, the sequel, because I feel I'm working on a follow-up. So what I'm going to do is just speak relatively informally with these images. Hopefully we won't have any technical issues, and I will be able to take you through some of the different projects that I have been working on in recent years. I wanted to start with this image from a collaboration between Zoe Leonard and Cheryl Dunier called the Faye Richards Photo Archive. And this was made through Zoe Leonard's photography in conjunction with Cheryl Dunier's film, The Watermelon Woman, which dates from, I believe, 1996. So it just celebrated its 25th anniversary. And again, I hope people will Google while I'm talking. I often do that. I would encourage you to Google all of these names for more images and more information. But I always show this slide because this construction of a fictional archive in photographs for Cheryl Dunier's film is, for me, continues to be an inspiration for my work on archives, and particularly for the need sometimes to invent archives where we don't have them. So we may not have a record of queer life, of LGBTQ life in the past, of ways in which people may have been involved in gender non-conforming behaviors, whatever terminology they used for their lives and their identities. They may have been involved in same-sex intimacies of some kind, and we do not have any kind of record of that past life. And this is where a key, to press that. This is where one of the things that has been very important to me in my work since publishing the book, An Archive of Feelings, which includes a discussion of The Watermelon Woman and of Zoe Leonard's photography work, is the role of artists. So this talk, one theme for my discussion today, will be about collaborations between artists and archival collections. What happens, for example, when artists become curators? What happens when artists create new forms of archives? How might we need to approach history, I will say, in a queer way, with an attention to all that is sometimes lost to the archival record and requires the work of the imagination in order to make history come through. So in this case, for example, Faye Richards is not a real person, but Cheryl Dunier and Zoe Leonard invented the story of a Black lesbian, particularly because often the archives don't record those who are racially minoritized, and imagined that she was playing roles in Hollywood films, but often very marginal roles as the maid or in these plantation melodramas that are in fact very racist. And so they imagined that perhaps off screen, Faye Richards was not a maid, but was a lesbian who performed in nightclubs, who had a series of lovers and so on. And so they created a photographic archive for this fictional life. So again, just wanted to start with that as an example of the kind of work that really interests me. At the end of the talk, I'll hope to show you another artist project in this same vein by the Canadian Indigenous artist Kent Monkman. Hopefully we'll have time to get to that. I can always show more during the Q&A since we have a lot of slides. Oh, let's see. Yeah. So another starting point for me is the Lesbian Herstory Archives in Brooklyn, New York. And it is indeed Pride Month in all over the world. And although I'm not in New York right now, I know that the streets have many flags. And I haven't looked, but I'm sure that the Lesbian Herstory Archives, which is housed in this brownstone in Brooklyn. It's like a house that is also an archive. So you have buttons and so on in the bathroom. You have Doc Martens next to lesbian pulp in the living room. I write about this collection in my book, An Archive of Feelings. And over these past 20 to 25 years since I first went there, I have returned many times. It's like a kind of pilgrimage always to return to this collection that continues to grow, that continues to evolve. I just went to some events this past year for their, I think, 45th anniversary. And they continue to do all kinds of amazing work where the archive becomes a community space for people to gather, to meet each other, to make use of their histories. So in my research, what I've been interested in is what's going on at the Lesbian Herstory Archives, but where does the spirit of this kind of grassroots archive that is outside of the conventions of the museum, the state, or the public library, where can just ordinary people collecting information about other ordinary people, where can that live? Where do we store it? What do we do with it? What kinds of histories can we make from it? And so just as I continue to draw upon the inspiration of Cheryl Dunye's Watermelon Woman and Zoe Leonard's Faye Richards photo archive, which actually Watermelon Woman includes a scene in a fictitious version of the Lesbian Herstory Archives. This is again my kind of like home base. Like I always come back there and then think about how that work is happening other places. So in the work that I have been doing, I've been interested to see other archival collections, and particularly this is another, in addition to the work that I've done over, let's say, the past 10 years, focusing on what happens when artists go to archives, I've been very interested in what happens when the LGBTQ archive finds its way into more traditional institutions like academic libraries and public libraries, state libraries, and so on. And at least in the US and Canada, there has been a kind of archives movement that is part of the LGBTQ movement. That is, as LGBTQ rights become more solidified, at least in North America, there has also been a corresponding institutionalization of the archive, which I think is a good thing. It means that our histories are taken seriously, but I think it's always necessary. I think this may be something that your organization is struggling with as well, is how do you keep the radical edge? How do you keep it queer and not just a kind of assimilationist LGBTQ project. They're both important. And so this is where I have found it very important for my work. And this is another thing I like to really promote when I'm making talks or when I'm teaching, is to encourage researchers, students, activists to both create archives, to collect and preserve materials, and also to find ways to create archival institutions that will serve our communities. So I have been looking at some different, I'll just put this up for a bit. This is a lot of text. I just used some of the slides, but these are some of the questions that I bring to the archive. I'm just thinking quickly for you in Istanbul. Always, everywhere I go, I'm interested in whether we want the archive to give us equal representation and visibility, or do we want to use the archive to challenge nationalist politics? And obviously in Turkey, the question of nationalist politics is a very serious one, particularly given the incredible legacy in the lands that you're in of multiple cultures converging, Kurdish, Armenian, Greek, etc., being part of that history. And so it would be interesting to think about how a very diverse set of LGBTQ or queer histories would also contribute to a history of the lands that you occupy today, where you are, as coming from multiple sources. And I'm also interested in this phenomenon of gay globalisms. Are you seeking simply to emulate the model of the US? And this is where I'm always a bit humble or interested. So I'm going to tell you about the places I've been, but that is not to say that those necessarily have to be the only model for the kinds of collections or archival activisms that you might create in Istanbul, in Turkey, in places in that part of the world. And then very important in North America, but particularly where we're thinking about indigenous occupation of land and decolonization, this is particularly true in Canada, where I'm currently living, is how can our LGBTQ queer archives also contribute to questions of decolonization? And again, this is very, very important actually to link the history of what's going on in the regions where you're living and the history of colonialism in the regions where I live. So I see a project of comparative colonialisms as very important, very, very important. So this might be one way that our different locations could speak to one another around a shared project of thinking LGBTQ archives in relation to histories of occupation, histories of colonization, and so on. I'll keep it very general, but obviously there's a lot we could say about the histories and the current politics there, as well as where I am. And so I'll just say too that the archives are a site of activism. They truly are. How information is circulated, both information about the past and information for the present, is very important. And one of the reasons I'm interested in archives is because having access to your history is very important for knowing how to proceed in the present. This is why one thing I've been very aware of in Istanbul is the erasure of history on the landscape, even as it is also very present. And so again, you are in a very, very important site for being able to see this tension between erasure and exposure, and to think about it as a kind of activism, right? To have those histories, whether they are on the streets or in the museums or libraries or universities, to be uncovered as a way of also knowing who you are in the present. So I'm just going to now take you through some examples of different artist practices and different archival collections that have been important to me. One of the artists who's also a touchstone is Tammy Ray Carland, who made a project called An Archive of Feelings. And this piece, it's a giant photograph. It's quite large. Again, you can Google her to find out more. And this is a photograph of mixtapes. Now, many of you are probably too young even to perhaps be familiar with the culture of the mixtape, but it's certainly very important to punk traditions, riot girl traditions from the 90s, is to make cassette tapes that are mixtapes. It's like now it would be like a Spotify mix where you splice together songs that are meaningful to you, that express your feelings. And by sharing them with your friends, you also share, here's my archive, what's your archive? And so that's why I love this title, One Love Leads to Another, where the love of music is also a way of establishing social connections. And this is also, I think, important, is the archive as a kind of act of love, right? That you keep something because you love it, and then sharing it with others is a way of building affections through the things that you love. This is another project called Herstory Inventory by Ulrika Mueller. I've written about this one at length. I have an article in progress that I hope will see the light of day. And this is a project where Ulrika Mueller went to the Lesbian Herstory archives. She found a list of T-shirts in the archives, and it's wonderful that the Lesbian Herstory Archive collects things like T-shirts because they're so important. I'm sure some of you have precious T-shirts that maybe, did you have a T-shirt for this festival? I'm sure there's posters. So actually for today, I wore this T-shirt of mine that's called, it says Homo Photo Club, and it's all these drawings of cameras. This one is actually made by my girlfriend, Gretchen Phillips, as part of a collective called Homo Photo Club. So this would be a T-shirt that might find its way into the archive. Someone would make a description of it. And what Ulrika Mueller did was to take these descriptions and give them as a drawing assignment to her friends. And so she produced 100 drawings by different artists of T-shirts in the collection. You can see here, this is an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, and with many T-shirts that had triangles in them. So these don't necessarily resemble in any way the original T-shirt, but it is again like this gift or this relay where we share our archival work, and it's a way of allowing it to travel, just as I'm traveling to you today. So I was quite fascinated by this project. And in fact, for the final event of the Brooklyn Museum, not too far from the Lesbian Herstory archives, Mueller actually did go and make T-shirts from the original drawing. So this is, I actually have this T-shirt here. I almost wore this one today. I think the description is something like Labris. This is the symbol of the trying to find my cursor. This is the symbol of the lesbian Amazons. That's kind of a mythic history as well. And from not so far from where you are. In fact, I'm also wearing my little Labris, the sign of the lesbian. People always ask what it is, but it's actually from, I believe, Crete, the island of Crete, which is where supposedly there's a tribe of Amazons. So this was a bit of a fiction of 1970s lesbians to turn this into their sign, and then the moon. Lavender Menace, of course, a very, very famous T-shirt from a lesbian insurrection against feminist organizations that seemed to be homophobic, and it's been taken up more recently by transgender activists to create a transgender menace t-shirt. So there's a way in which these histories become available to be recirculated for meanings that have significance for people in the present. So I loved this kind of circling of history, right? The relay back and forth between the archival material, the inspiration to contemporary artists, and then the recirculation of these t-shirts, most of them made in the 1970s, but now available again in the 2010s. This is just a couple of other images from that project. I love this image of multiple women connected. Yeah. So then, in addition to always paying attention to what artists are doing in different archives, especially the Lesbian Herstory archives, I've also been interested in other collections. So I've gone to Los Angeles quite a bit. The One National Lesbian and Gay Archives, which is now housed at the University of Southern California, is fantastic. It's one of the biggest archival collections in the world, and they do amazing work there, and including art exhibitions. I encourage you to Google them and look up the work there. I have spent time in the June Mazer Lesbian Archives, which is based in Hollywood in Los Angeles, but which also, most of its collections are housed at UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles. So I've been very interested in these partnerships that have happened really since the 90s, over the last 20 years, where suddenly universities, which in the past didn't really care about LGBTQ history, suddenly they're like, we want to help you. Let's take your collection. Let's preserve it. And in fact, the resources of the university, if they choose to devote them to LGBTQ history or other minoritized histories, there's a lot of work now on creating different kinds of African-American and Black studies archives, Mexican-American archives, working class archives, and so on. So this is where there is an archive movement to create new collections that represent marginalized histories. So here's a pair of Birkenstocks in the collection in Los Angeles. I spent time going to UCLA, and yeah, they did this. You can find this online. This is an amazing resource guide that you can just download as a PDF to find out more about what's in the Mazer archives. And so I've just spent time. I had a lot of fun just looking at June Mazer's archive. I wrote a little piece about the Valentines to her girlfriend, you know, the way in which we collect these items that are of sentimental value. So, for example, you know, if you have a relationship with someone very special, you might think about, you know, what do I save from this relationship that's meaningful? So I loved that the archive included these drawings of, you know, animals and the backyard and these artifacts of ordinary lesbian lives. So that's been also a principle from the Lesbian Herstory archives is we don't just collect materials from famous people. Everybody's life is important. Everybody has a collection of things that are important to them that could be valuable to include in an archive. And here's just, I'm always interested because not everybody is a famous writer, for example, who has manuscripts. I've been interested in, again, this notion of ephemera, of what is it that people collect, these objects, the strange different pieces of things that might be a record of their lives. So I always, when I go to LGBTQ archives, or if I'm working with students, I say, find the ephemera, look for the strange stuff that doesn't quite fit into the archive. This was a collection of, this is in the Mazer archives, a collection of, this is in the early days of social media where lesbians were trading notes with each other, finding each other and discussing popular culture, things like Katie Lang. And this woman is interested in information about average, i.e. not famous lesbians. And so she donated to the June Mazer a set of printouts of all of the emails she had exchanged with other lesbians about popular culture. Very interesting. And so this is what they look like. Again, something that others might not think is important, that have been collected and are available when you go to the UCLA Research Library. Also, I was very interested in this Tiger Woman papers. Is a woman, people have tried to find her, they can't, but her material is there of poems that she wrote and collected in these books. She and her girlfriend at the time, Han Tifam, made these different zines, and they're homemade books that are a record of their lives. Here's Han Tifam on the right, standing in front of the Mazer collection. So a way of saying, my life is valuable, I want to record it, and so I will. This is another person, Esther Bentley, who made this amazing screen of all of, so this is her, in a way, her own personal archive. She collected photographs, quotations, and she made a big screen for her room where she can see all the women that she cares about. And this is now in the archive. So this is just an example of the kind of material that I have found it very interesting to write about. I have an article about the Mazer that's coming out. Can I just look at, yeah, I'm gonna just take us through a few more examples quickly. You can follow up and Google them later before we open it up. So this is just quickly some materials from Esther Bentley's collection. Again, these boxes that have all kinds of sentimental trinkets. Here's a rainbow flag for Pride Month, and collections of magazines. Here's photographs of Esther Bentley, young and old, that are an important record of an older lesbian life. She was born, I believe, in the 1920s. And so important to have these records of lesbian life. This is in Southern California in the 30s, 40s, 50s, definitely before Stonewall. And so having a record of people in the US who were in fact creating lesbian cultures, queer cultures prior to an organized movement is a very valuable record. You see also these photographs of her home where clearly people collect things. I'm sure you do too, that are, so we're all in a way kind of amateur or personal archivists. And I've always been interested in why LGBTQ people see that, oh, I need to collect things because other people might not save my life. So this is just from her home. This is one of her girlfriends. And again, I'm writing about this at length, but it's just, these are very lovely things to find in the files. This is another archival collection and ordinary person. Another important one to look at. We can put the links in the chat later, but the human sexuality collections at Cornell have been another place where I've spent a lot of time. And I was quite fascinated by the collections of Robert Lynch. And I have a short piece that I wrote about it just a few months ago that has a lot of images. And so I'll just make sure you have the link to that one because it's available online. But this very large collection of Robert Lynch, who's a Black gay man who died of AIDS in the 1990s. And he knew he was dying. He knew that Cornell had a collection. He had tried to give his collections to Harvard University, where he had been a student. They were not interested. But this is where it's very important sometimes to have collections that are focused on LGBTQ lives, because he then went to Cornell, and because they had an LGBTQ archive, they were interested in his materials. And included in his collections are these slides that are very sexually explicit, essentially pornographic slides of men that he probably had sex with, or at least, had a friendly relationship, and did these photo shoots with men who were naked. And he saved it. And then he wanted it to be in an archival collection. And fortunately, Brenda Marston, who's the curator at Cornell, thought it very important, thought this kind of material was very important, that it was important to have a record of sex and not just to think that it's obscene or perverse or something to throw away or declare illegal. So I love that also these materials are preserved, including a lot of his notebooks. Again, he had a lot of papers in the notebooks. He also collected, he was a folklorist. He was very interested in the African-American culture of North Carolina, where he lived. So, he collects naked men, he collects quilts, and he collects folk art. Again, he was quite a collector as a gay man. And all of these collections, in my mind, are connected to one another. Here's just a little bit of a sense of some of the more sort of sexually explicit imagery. I feel quite reluctant to share too much of these images publicly, just because some of these people may still be alive. So there are ethical issues around sharing the images at the same time as I think it's important that they are in the archival collection. Also, he collected plants, very interested in where does the outside world come into the archive. And so he often took these plants and put them into his notebook. So that's another kind of interesting archival material. And then I too have been very interested in becoming a curator. It's not what I'm trained to do, but I found so many things in archives that I've wanted to share them. So while I was still teaching at the University of Texas at Austin, I was very happy to be able to look through their collections of LGBTQ materials. And with my students, we created this exhibition on queer intimacies that included photographs of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, of Sylvia Beach, who was an important owner with her girlfriend, her partner, Adrienne Monnier, of the Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris. And so I wanted to find materials that would show the queer content of the modernist literature that is collected in the Harry Ransom Center. They really have not done very much in the way of LGBTQ programming. And so this was an effort on my part to try to push in that direction. It was very fun to do this little exhibition. There's much more I could say about each artifact. It was also a lot of work, so it gave me a real appreciation for the work of curators in taking these materials and making something that can be public, and also made me appreciate all the more the artists who take the material and present it in very creative ways. I wrote a blog post. Again, we can put that in the chat. I have another little essay with more pictures that tells you about this exhibition. And then I said the last one I would show, this has been very important to me, and I've also written an essay on this work by the Canadian artist Kent Monkman, who is Cree, from Manitoba, who did this amazing exhibition for the 150th centenary of Canada, in which he focused on Indigenous culture, and particularly the terrible history of genocide, of destruction of Indigenous ways of life. And Monkman uses as his It's very queer. So he has this drag figure called Mischief Eagle Testicle. And in this piece, he takes a historical painting, which is very important in Canadian history. It's the story of how the British and the French had a battle and Canada became British rather than French. And so he took a 18th century French painting, a Fragonard painting called The Swing. And here is Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, who's the Indigenous woman who is kind of dominating over these British and French colonizers. His work is very funny. It's like a queer take on history. It's like if you walked into any of the incredible museums in Istanbul and you had a queer artist who had like free reign to just be able to rearrange all the collections. You know, for example, if one could easily do this with the Topkapi Palace and the history of the sultans and the harems and so on, you know, there's a queer story that's already there and just waiting to happen. So Monkman takes the conventional narrative of colonial history and turns it on its head. He does these history paintings where this is, I think, called the Bears of Confederation, where these men are, you know, in leather and the bears are having their way with them rather than the other way around. And here's Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, again, this indigenous two-spirit character who can rewrite a history of indigenous genocide. I also like these plates that have these photographs on it. It's a very interesting exhibition. I can also give you the citation or send to you the article that I wrote about this exhibition. But for me, it's, I think that's all. This is one more where this is one of our first prime minister in Canada, and here's his wife as Monkman, kind of crying for the history of colonialism. But this, for me, is also the direction I would like to see LGBTQ archiving going in, is to rewrite all of our histories, right? So not just to preserve LGBTQ history, but to use that history to write a very different story of our different national histories, and then also the links, right? Because to my mind, one reason I've been so interested in the history of Istanbul and Turkey, both past and present, is that if we don't know that history, there's a lot of ways in which the history where you are is very connected to the history where I am. And so we need also to share these decolonial and queer histories in order to make a different kind of archive and make a different kind of history. Okay, I think maybe I will, oh yeah, here's just some readings. So I'll stop there. I know I've gotten a little bit late, but we said we could go longer. And I know sometimes people are shy if, you know, because you're having to ask questions in English, which may not be your first language. So however you want to handle that, Cemre or Zahra, if people want to ask questions not in English, you could translate for me, whatever you want to do.
Yes, of course, we can translate their questions. And thank you very much for your talk. And now we would like to ask you a few questions. And as I said before, if our participants have questions, they can chat to our friend name Ask Me, or they can directly raise their hands. So if it is okay, I'm going to ask the first question. So my question is, what is the importance of oral history in the process of creating the collective memory of lesbian public culture? And how is the transformation of this collective memory, if there is?
Yes. I'm so glad you asked this question, because I think you're familiar with the oral history work that I did in my book, An Archive of Feelings. For those who aren't familiar with the book, I'll just say that I interviewed lesbian AIDS activists who'd been active in ACT UP in New York for the book. And indeed, oral history is crucial. And I'm sorry I haven't mentioned it until now, so I'm glad you brought it up. It's something I've been thinking about in a range of ways recently. But first of all, I will say, for me, oral history is also a way of unsettling the conventional archive. So what I've presented to you today is various collections, right, that are based on paper documentation, objects, and so on. But it is very important to have the people's voices. So for me, oral history projects are also another very, very important tool for any archival collection, particularly when you are seeking to document marginalized voices. It's an easy way to be able to say to someone, your life is important, come, let me interview you. In fact, during this pandemic time, a lot of my students a year ago were very worried that they weren't going to be able to complete their research projects because they might not be able to do interviews. And instead, with Zoom, they were able to do interviews that maybe they would not have been able to do very easily in person because it takes more time, you have to travel and so on. So in fact, Zoom has been very useful for oral history. Even though you don't get to be with the person, it's important. And I, in fact, did some oral histories this last year. In fact, the people I had interviewed for my book, I wanted to know, what are you thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic based on what you know about the HIV AIDS pandemic? And so it was like getting to have a conversation with these dear friends to compare notes, but we recorded it for Columbia University. And so it will be in an archive. So I think oral history is crucial. And in fact, another longer discussion we could have is, what is the relation between oral history as a form of documentation and collecting materials? How can they complement each other? And that is another piece of archive theory I'm interested to explore further. So thank you for asking. Yeah.
Thank you for answering. So can I ask for something? Can you please stop sharing so we can see our
Yeah, then I can see everyone. Yeah, I thought I'd put this up and then yeah, and if people want to turn on their cameras now that we are in the Q&A, it is even for a minute, but no pressure.
So now I see the Shayma's hands. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today, dear Cvetkovich. My question is related with the question Cemre asked. My question is regarding oral history studies have been seen as inferior to written ones in academia. Which kind of problems is LGBTIQ plus collective memory transmission facing in the context of oral history studies, and how do you describe this transmission?
So can I just ask a question back first, because I was wondering, now we've had two questions about oral histories. Are you asking me because you are involved in an oral history project in particular?
No, but I search your works and I wonder this question.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll say a couple of things that are always interesting to me about oral history in general, and then thinking about it from LGBTQ angle is very important. Still for me, and this was true when I did interviews 20 years ago for that book project, and I've done other ones since then, but that was where I learned, what is it like to interview someone? Always I'm interested in what happens if you want to ask people difficult questions of things they don't want to talk about. and of course, I'm always interested in documenting painful experiences as well as joyful experiences. So it's always an experiment on how to create the kind of safety or intimacy that would make someone feel comfortable about sharing their life with you. And I don't have one model for that, for how to make that work. I think, again, this is why I'm interested in questions of affect and feeling. It's a very fluid, unpredictable one. I always ask people. I was actually very happy with my involvement with this project. I'm going to put the with this project this past year. That they actually interviewed the interviewers. It's a thing to always remember if you do happen to be involved in an oral history project, is make sure you get someone to interview you because there's so much that you also are bringing to the project. You can look this up. So I will be in the archive as well with my ideas about these interviews. And, you know, I think I'm always interested in what if someone cries in an interview? That's okay. You know, what if you get off track on something unrelated? It's okay. Like, there are no rules. It's a very, to me, like, queer fluid research process, because you never know what's going to happen. It's also very exhausting. I was reminded of this when I did my interviews last year on the pandemic. I mean, obviously the topic was very emotionally heavy in a way, but it just, trying to make a connection with someone, it's so draining, and it's like their life comes into you and then you try to keep it safe. It's very interesting. Very interesting. One other thing I was going to say, in addition to people talking about painful experiences, it's like, how do you, when in LGBTQ studies, we're interested in the intimate details of people's lives, right? Sex, love, intimacy. And so how do you get people to talk about sex? Like, it might be something you only discuss with your best friend, and now someone's asking you questions and recording them for an archive. So it's a very interesting dynamic to try to, I think what I've done is also suggest to people, no, this is historically important. Like, this is a gift you are sharing with others, because your own experience is actually valuable for other people to hear, even if it maybe seems a little bit, you know, private.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So we have Enis.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for being here with us tonight and showing your solidarity as well, to be honest. And thank you for all the works that you've written so far, because they've been so illuminating and mind-opening for me, at least. So I had written down my questions, so I think it's better for me to read it from there. And actually, sure. I will bring up an example of a queer archive, maybe from Istanbul in this respect. So my master's thesis, I'm planning to focus on the studio photography archive of an Armenian woman photographer from Istanbul, Mariam Shahinyan, who is also a survivor of the Armenian genocide. What drives me to her archive is its rich repertoire of representations of queer people from 1940s and 50s Istanbul. But we do not have much information about these people who we see in the archive besides their pictures. And in this respect, I feel troubled sometimes in assigning an identity to these people, considering them to be queer, just because I feel or sense a kind of affinity to their gestures and poses that I see in the archive. And actually, I know, for example, theorists like Gayatri Gopinath offer a kind of perspective in this respect, but I really want to hear your take on this issue, like how one deals with these issues when working with a visual archive. And maybe following on that, I also want to ask you, what makes an archive queer in your opinion in general? is the purpose of the archive that itself makes it a queer archive, or is it the belated readings of the archive that gives it a queer, maybe, quality, so to say?
Yes, thank you. Those are both excellent questions. I would love to see the materials that you're working with, because I find so often it's hard to make one generalization, right? So what's hard is that it's interesting, but also difficult for you, the researcher, to be placed in this ethically sensitive position and to have to find a way for the work. I'm glad you mentioned Gayatri Gopinath, because as you were speaking, I was thinking of her work. We'll just put it in the chat. I'm forgetting the title of her new book, but it has amazing
Unruly Visions.
Yeah, has a lot of visual material in it, and in fact, I have a very close relationship with that book, because she's been a friend of mine for many years, and I actually was a reader for the book for the press, so I kind of helped advise her on what she should do with it. And it's just, I think it's work that's really wonderful, and I felt like she was doing many things that were very close in spirit to my own work, but working with archives around the world, and particularly South Asian archives from Kerala, where she's from, where she encountered some of these issues you're describing. And as I said with oral history, it's like there are no rules. Like, I think you will have to think very carefully of perhaps it's not as though you can operate like a conventional historian. And this is where the queer method comes in, right? Where there is a bit of act of imagination or speculation with regard to how you choose to describe the images. So you may be making a relationship with the person. And this is why I hope people will maybe have a chance to go look to the piece that I published in the Baffler. It's also in the document that was shared. I had so many, so I just showed you some slides that I've showed in a PowerPoint, right? And these days people are recording, so the images might get out there. But when I was gonna actually publish something, I got so nervous that perhaps, you know, I ended up not using certain images because I didn't feel comfortable. If I couldn't get permission from the person, I didn't know if I could really share them. And in fact, one of the things about the Cornell collection is that the curator has been collecting things where she doesn't know the people whose materials it is, like just finding photo albums like through eBay and other things, these things that have been thrown away. And then you look at the album and it's like, this is amazing. Or another example is there's photo documentation from some like, actually it would be appropriate to call them transvestites or cross-dressers who recorded their work. And now museums are wanting to curate these images because they're of great historical value. So for me, it's a dance. And it is important to think about how the images are going to circulate, and especially because of digital circulation, there's a lot more issues. So I know part of your question is also, what do you say about them? Not just how do they circulate, but I think it's important to keep the struggle present. You know, don't try to solve the problem, but maybe make the problem part of what the project is that you can't say for sure. And yet, you know, these materials also can be very valuable. So in the case of Robert Lynch, for example, I wanted to be able to share this work. I mean, he gave it to an archive because he wanted people to take seriously these things he had collected, both of his own and of other people. So this is where, as contemporary scholars or archivists or artists, we also are the stewards, the caretakers for these people's lives from the past, and we have to think carefully about the ethical responsibility, and again try to come from a place of love, right? Like what is the right thing to do? And this is where the queer method comes in. Again, it may not be what a traditional historian would do, but I think I would say, yes, I think I will keep it brief, but the last part of your question of like what makes a queer archive, I'm very interested in ways in which we could think of the archive as queer, not just because it has LGBTQ content, but because it takes this more affectively based, creatively based, imaginative relation to archival materials and the construction of history. So it does things differently. And again, at the end of my talk, I was saying this is of broad relevance, not just for LGBTQ histories, but for all histories. Yeah.
Thank you so
I'll
much
stop
for
there.
the answers.
Yeah. Other questions?
Thank you very much for your answers. And there's no hands. We can.
As asked me, I have two questions actually. Firstly, thank you for being with us now. I'll share them with you separately. So first, how do you contextualize lesbian culture of feeling in the public culture in a wider sense? This is the question.
Oh, that was a lot packed into. Can you just read it one more time?
Sure. How do you contextualize lesbian culture of feeling in the public culture in a wider sense?
So contextualize, that is like how to make it meaningful for other people. Is that part of what you're saying? Maybe I'm not.
Maybe.
I just want to make sure I understand your question fully. I know it's a good one, and I don't want to go in a wrong direction. Can you say a little bit more? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I can write it to you actually in a chat, or I can say, how do you contextualize lesbian culture of feeling in the public culture in a wider sense?
Okay. Well, I'm going to just take your question in a particular direction. If it's not what you had in mind, let me know. But I'm just thinking also, I'm going to be at a conference in Berlin next week. You could look it up. Sorry, I'm just. It's at the ICI in Berlin, and it's going to be called "What Happened to Lesbian and Gay Studies." And I think part of the goal is going to be to talk about whether the term lesbian and even the term gay is now becoming out of date or antiquated. So I'm thinking that one way I understand your question is just that we're talking about these very narrow subcultures, where we might understand each other and it's not widely known to the broader public. So that's where the work of contextualization comes in. But even inside of LGBTQ cultures, there is this sense that like lesbian feminist culture is outmoded. Some people see it as quite transphobic in some cases. And so I think this is part of the work of history, right? That an archivist can do, is we're always trying to create contexts. I think that's why I'm stumbling a little bit with your question, because I want contextualize is a very general term. So if you have something else in mind, I'd be interested in it. But it's why I have been very interested in the work of curation, because I find something when I do archival research, and then, it means something to me, but how do I make it mean something to someone else? And this is partly why curation is a very interesting practice, because you can contextualize in so many different ways. The conventional curatorial practice is you put a little label on the wall, right? But artist curators might write very, very creative wall texts, or they have some other approach to explaining the material. So this is where contextualization is very interesting to me as a process. Oh, I totally forgot about, I'm just writing about another artist. I'm going to put his name. This is a great project at QAG. So Benny Nemorowski Ramsay is a Canadian artist. He lives in Paris. And he did this project where he visited gay men's libraries in Montreal, London, Paris, Amsterdam, and he made these recordings. So they're private collections. So he moved from the archive to sound as a way of contextualizing. And then during the pandemic, his show couldn't happen in the way that it usually did. And so he had he organized a project where people listened to the audio tape, which was very creative, about the library, and then they made flower arrangements. So it was from library to audio to floral arrangement. And I thought this is a kind of contextualization. It's like, how do you capture the feeling by making a flower arrangement rather than writing a description? So this, to me, is also the queer method, right? Of contextualization is ideally a creative process at the same time as you try to teach people about history. So Benny's project has a lot of good information about these amazing personal libraries that these different gay male activists have collected. Yeah. Did you have a second question?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And the second is, what is the relation between queer archival history and organization? What changed after the Industrial Revolution?
Oh, wait, it was the relation between, did you say queer archive and organization? You said organization?
No, I'm sorry. Queer archive history and urbanization.
Oh, urbanization. Ah. Oh, so interesting. Yeah. So this has been a big question for gay historians, right? To what extent is queer history, queer public history as we know it, and urbanization connected? And so there have been important histories of New York, of London, of small. I don't know if there's been one on Istanbul. Has there? Has someone done there is, for example, my friend Sofia Marabit has done a book on gay Beirut, which would be an interesting one. It's a bit closer to Istanbul. You know, those cities have an interesting connection. So yes, the process of thinking urbanization and gay history is very important. When you ask about industrialization and urbanization, clearly also we're talking about histories of capitalism. So I think of, for me, the really important foundational theory is John D'Amelio's Capitalism and Gay Identity. This is just one model, because increasingly in the US, people have been looking at where there are LGBTQ and gender nonconforming identities and communities that are outside of urban spaces. So it's not the only trajectory. But this is where I wanted to also respond to your question by thinking about it in relation to what is the history of the archive in connection with this history of industrialization. So how would we put LGBTQ, I'm putting this in the chat just because I want to make sure people, because it's such an interesting project. So if we're trying to link these three things, right? Gender and sexual identity, capitalism, industrialization, urbanization, and then the archive. That's a very interesting set of histories to connect, in part because in my work, one of the things I've been very interested in is how is the history of the archive also bound up with modernity and capitalism. So I think, for example, about if you look at the history of national archives, it's very interesting. You know, arguably the archive takes a certain shape in relation to the modern nation state. I'm thinking, for example, about Napoleon in France. So if you go to the National Archives of France, you realize that France post-revolution, Napoleon created the archives as a way of saying, I'm great, France is great. And that model, the French model, definitely traveled to other countries, including Canada, including the US. Although, and you know, again, this is an interesting comparative question. When I've gone to Eastern Europe, I don't know about Turkey. I do know for Turkey, one of the issues, because I've had students who've worked on Ottoman culture, is the modern Turkish state, you know, in a sense, shut down the Ottoman archives. Even just the shift to a new language means that scholars are limited, unless they know Ottoman, in how they can work with the Ottoman archives. Although I have had students I have a student who did in the US a dissertation on Ottoman literature, Ottoman era literature. And so there's just so much also to say there about, for example, church archives. So the church, the Catholic Church, for example, kept very, very detailed records that become another model for the modern nation state creating its paper archive. Sorry, your question just opens up so many directions for historical and comparative inquiry, where I think I'm interested in seeing more histories of the archive that could then sit alongside of histories of gender and sexuality. And so again, this would be part of what I was describing as decolonizing the archive, and coming up with different understandings of ways in which nation states preserve their power by keeping a particular kind of archival record. And so when you cannot access the archives, your history is denied. So one place I work is the Balkans with the split up of like Serbia, and this is former Ottoman Empire territory. So Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, and so on. Their national archives are a mess, or in Bosnia, where everyone is fighting over whose archive is whose. The Serbian National Archives have been closed for many years, and there are a lot of records they don't want people to access because there are property records. I'm sure this would be true in Turkey as well. The records of Greek ownership of certain properties would be, you know, off the table. So again, this is where the archive is a very, sorry, I wasn't going to talk about the politically sensitive areas, but I'm sure there's many stories to tell. I'll stop there. Thank you. Now we're getting over time. What do you think, Tamer?
Since I don't see any hands or questions, so maybe our question and answer session is done.
Okay.
So it was a really beneficial and colorful lecture for us. Thank you again for coming. It was an honor to host you here. So lastly, because of the pandemic, we find online alternatives to everything, unfortunately. So now can we take a souvenir photo without getting out of the Zoom? My friends can take screenshots.
Yeah. Is, are you getting everybody or just me?
We all, everybody.
Yeah. My t-shirt.
Thank you. Again, thank you very much for coming.
Did you get it?
Yes.
Sorry, I had my headphones off. Thank you. This was very inspiring for me. And I hope we will remain connected somehow, or if and when I'm ever able to travel to Istanbul again, perhaps we'll be able to meet. So I wish you the best with your other events. And thank you very much for having me. And please stay in touch.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Again. Take care of yourself.
You too. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.